I knew something was wrong the second my badge lit up red. Not orange, not try again yellow, red. No vibration, no unlock click, no security guard nodding me through. Just a dead panel and the faint hum of a server room that, until that moment, had always felt like home. I stood there in the hallway, same boots I'd worn for 3 winters, same thermos of gas station coffee in my hand, and watched junior engineers scurry past me like I was a ghost. One even muttered, "She's still here?" Like I was some relic that missed her own funeral. If you're already pulled into this mess, do me one favor. Subscribe and like the video. 97% of folks never do. And trust me, this story, you're gonna want to see how it ends. It's not just petty office drama. It's a goddamn cautionary tale about what happens when arrogance meets architecture. Now, back to the red light. I didn't panic. Panic is for people who don't have disaster protocols embedded 6 layers deep in a system that's too elegant for Jonah Price to even comprehend. He was brought in during New Year's under the shiny label of COO transformation hire, said he had ideas, said we were stale, said agility was the future, and I, apparently, was a stubborn bottleneck with a keyboard. He made jokes about my setup being paranoid, bloated, held together with gum and veteran trauma, all while sipping espresso from a self-heating mug like he was the messiah of cloud computing. He never once asked what Protocol Theta was. I designed Nexora's infrastructure from the ground up, hybrid layered, regionally mirrored, zero trust by default. I had disaster triggers hardwired into our compliance architecture. The whole system was tied to sovereign admin credentials, because Nexora didn't technically own the root access. My LLC did. That was the agreement, quietly signed by a CIO 3 regimes ago when they begged me to rebuild after the last security breach nearly cost them a defense contract. I was the failsafe. So when they yanked my badge without a word, not even a courtesy exit interview, they didn't just fire a systems architect. They pulled the pin on their own infrastructure. Here's how it worked. My login had hourly validation across key services, API layers, billing nodes, hypervisors. When those checks started failing, the system didn't ask questions. It assumed compromise. First, it issued soft warnings, internal pings invisible to most. Then, after 5 failed handshakes, Protocol Theta kicked in. A 58-minute silent countdown. No klaxons, no emails. Just a rolling kill chain that began at the outermost nodes and moved inward like a tide erasing footprints in the sand. At that point, I was back in my truck. Didn't bother texting anyone. What was I going to say? Hey, you fired the only person who knows where the trap doors are? They wouldn't listen. They hadn't listened when I told them 6 months ago that outsourcing our DevOps to a glossy platform vendor would be a security risk. Jonah waved it off, of course. We're simplifying roles, he'd said, staring at my diagrams like they were in Latin. Security's outdated. Outdated. Right. The same outdated security that kept us audit compliant through 3 federal reviews. The same redundancy model that let us migrate 2 data centers during a Category 4 hurricane without losing a single client-facing process. But to Jonah, if it didn't come with a neon dashboard and a Slack plugin, it was obsolete. So, yeah, they let me go. But they forgot that the system wasn't built to trust them. It was built to trust me. And when that trust broke, the architecture didn't scream. It didn't whine. It just moved. Quietly, relentlessly, bite by bite, and that was only minute 1. Jonah called it the refresh agenda, like we were decluttering a closet instead of gutting a living organism. First to go was the on-site DevOps team. Half of them found out via Slack message, time-stamped during their lunch breaks. Redundancies in process, he wrote, with that smug little period at the end like he'd just put down a child's tantrum. Most of those folks had been with Nexora longer than he'd been out of diapers in the corporate world, but he wanted lean, cheap, flashy, and nothing gets in the way of a good quarterly pitch like competent, expensive humans. Then came his pitch deck, slides full of pastel graphs and vendor logos. He wanted to migrate everything to a third-party cloud suite that promised zero-touch scalability and frictionless user experience. Marketing garbage. No one in that boardroom seemed to notice that half those features required a complete rewrite of our backend, or that the platform's own SLA buried its liabilities under so many asterisks, It looked like a Vegas casino contract. I told all of them, exactly what this meant. That Nexora's infrastructure wasn't just an Amazon EC2 sandbox with a few Python scripts duct taped on. We had a dual auth system, physical presence plus digital confirmation. Our core layer admin tokens were encrypted and time-stamped, and every major system dependency was routed through custodian protocols. I spelled it out, slow and calm. If you remove the credential that owns the core, you don't just lose control, you void the system's identity. It doesn't trust you anymore. Jonah just leaned back and said, "We're not in 2014 anymore, sweetheart. We're streamlining roles. Security's outdated." Sweetheart. I kept my expression neutral. I've dealt with men like Jonah my entire career. Men who think confidence is a skill and not a side effect of never being held accountable. He talked fast, smiled wide, name-dropped his Stanford cohort like it was a badge. And he never asked where the foundation of the system came from. Never bothered to read the compliance docs signed by our former CIO, Carter Mendez. The same Carter who brought me in during the ransomware panic of 17 and quietly embedded sovereign license protocols into the rebuild. My LLC, Redline Custodial Systems, was the named administrator of record, not just a contractor. The license itself was conditional on me. The root token, generated on a physical HSM I owned, not Nexora. Legally binding, system critical, and buried, by Carter's design, under Section 18C of our compliance framework. An override path that required my biometric confirmation, my hardware, and in-person activation, all for one reason: to prevent exactly this kind of reckless takeover. I warned Jonah, twice, in writing. He skimmed the email and replied with a thumbs-up emoji, so I stopped warning him. I stopped arguing. I started watching, documenting, because if he wanted a clean slate, I'd let him have it. He just didn't realize the chalkboard was wired to a failsafe, and when the eraser touched it, when he deleted me from the system, he didn't clear the past. He detonated the future. January 2nd started like any other first day back, salt trucks still working overtime, stale air from a building that hadn't seen circulation since the office holiday party, and my boots leaving slush ghosts on the tile. I tapped my badge at 8:03 a.m., same time I always did, same door I'd walked through nearly every weekday for 6.5 years. But this time, the reader didn't glow green. It flashed red. I stood there a second too long, like maybe I'd just swiped too fast. Tried again. Red. Again. Red. And then one more time, slower now, like a prayer in plastic. Red. I didn't get mad. I didn't knock. I didn't call HR. I just turned, walked back to my truck, and sat in the driver's seat while the heater coughed awake. Pulled out my backup terminal, air-gapped, encrypted, and running a live feed of the network's admin traffic. It didn't need Office, Wi-Fi. It didn't need a Nexora IP. It just needed time, and it had enough. By design, my system performed hourly validations to confirm active identity trust. When those checks failed, when the root credentials were revoked without a valid key rotation, it didn't throw a tantrum. It quietly marked the event as a Class 4 anomaly. 3 failures in a row? That was a warning. 5? That was a compromise, and compromise triggered Protocol Theta. I watched the console light up like New Year's Eve, a right-on cue. A soft pulse at first, flagged but suppressed. 38 seconds in, Theta's subroutine activated. Mirrored rollback initialized. It didn't just lock the doors. It began to reverse the entire infrastructure, stripping permissions, nulling out privileged layers, collapsing the framework like a controlled demolition from the outer rim inward. All while the lights in HR probably stayed blissfully fluorescent. 58 minutes. That was the window. Enough time to allow for a mistaken badge deactivation, just in case this was some clumsy clerical error, the kind Jonah would later try to pin on miscommunication. But once that clock started, there was no pause button. It had to be stopped in person, with 2-factor authentication that required both my live biometric signature and a hardware key only I carried, in my coat pocket, right then, outside. With no intention of re-entering, no override from inside the system. That was the failsafe. And it wasn't a secret. It had been reviewed during 3 federal audits. Jonah just didn't think the architect he erased was still holding the keys. At minute 7, the staging environments began cloning themselves to encrypted cold storage, a step most never noticed unless they knew where to look. At minute 11, the logs began to fracture. Then, the fun part. At minute 15, legacy admin tiers began to dissolve, collapsing any access role not directly validated against a current handshake token. I sipped my coffee and watched it happen. Somewhere inside, someone would be realizing that Jenkins wasn't pushing builds, that the testbed servers weren't syncing, that Git hooks were breaking with unauthorized messages even though their badges still worked. And by minute 22, internal IT would start panicking. They'd try to roll credentials. They'd try to escalate. They'd find out none of the admin tunnels accepted override traffic. Because those tunnels were tied to me. Not Nexora, not Jonah. Me. There was no loud boom, no Hollywood-style meltdown, just silence, and a heartbeat of data that slowed, flickered, and began to vanish, one packet at a time. At 9:01 a.m. sharp, the silence ended. It started with a billing alert, not even a loud one, just a flicker on a monitor in finance, a quiet, unable to retrieve node ledger, warning that probably didn't register until someone refreshed the dashboard and realized all the revenue channels had flatlined. 5 minutes later, the app clusters began to flicker, fail-over events that should have triggered instant recovery, except nothing came back online. Entire microservice groups blinked out like dying fireflies. Internal DNS records stopped resolving. Load balancers threw 503s across every primary endpoint. And then came the API calls. Thousands of null returns. Zero latency. Not slow. Dead. By 9:12, every department had descended into chaos. I know, because 2 junior engineers who used to sit outside my old office started frantically texting one of my former teammates. Their messages read like panicked Morse code. Are you seeing this? Prod is down? WTF is happening? DNS says no domain found? What was happening was simple. The system wasn't down. It was gone. Jonah had greenlit the badge revocations, thinking he was making a clean cut, like a gardener trimming dead branches. What he actually did was rip out the root, and the system, obedient and loyal only to its sovereign key, responded accordingly. It didn't crash. It didn't throw a tantrum. It followed its protocol. Erase everything that can no longer be verified. Internal IT moved fast. I'll give them that, but not fast enough. By the time they realized they couldn't log into the hypervisor management layer, the metadata had already begun to self-prune. The internal console flashed. Root access validation failed. Administrative session expired. Permission chain null. And the backups? Locked. Mirrored on regions that now considered them orphans. They tried rerouting failover through the smart relay system, but that system too was tied to the original gateway. And that gateway authenticated only through my identity, not a general admin group, not a backup token. Me. Someone probably shouted, "Override it." But the override protocol required both my biometric key and a secondary auth chip, an unassuming black rectangle that had been sitting in my purse for 3 years. It was physically paired to the sovereign license and updated quarterly. They didn't have it. Jonah was likely in some boardroom by then, waving his hands, blaming legacy code fragility, talking about vendor transitions and unscalable processes, saying things like, "This wouldn't be happening if we'd already switched platforms." The kind of nonsense executives say when they realize they're bleeding from a wound they can't see yet. But by 9:28, they saw it. Internal logs began disappearing. The deployment queues for every major client project turned up empty. Project folders for the top 3 revenue streams returned invalid reference object. The system wasn't just wiping what they had, it was removing the memory of it. Offline didn't mean broken. Offline meant unrecoverable. Their smart platform migration? Pointless now. There was nothing left to migrate. The funniest part, if you can find humor in a slow-motion corporate amputation, was that I'd actually built all of this for them, not against them. It wasn't sabotage, it was structure. Designed to protect their data, their contracts, their legacy, all of it conditioned on one very clear assumption, that the architect wouldn't be thrown out like an expired parking pass without so much as a debrief. It wasn't vengeance, it was architecture, and it did exactly what it was supposed to do. By 10:11 a.m., they'd stopped trying to fix the system and started trying to understand it. Legal was summoned. Not just the in-house team, outside counsel, cyber law experts, contract specialists. People in suits who had never once set foot near the server room, now huddled in war rooms trying to decode the very paperwork they'd all signed and promptly forgotten. It was somewhere between the third and fourth frantic binder crack that someone finally whispered the phrase I'd been waiting for. Clause 18C. They found it in the compliance protocol binder, buried under a section nobody had opened since the CIO turnover 5 years ago. Section title: Custodial Sovereignty Agreements. Subsection: License Retention Conditions. And there it was, in precise legalese that had passed federal review more than once. All sovereign system components licensed under third-party custodial LLCs retain self-regulatory privilege upon admin invalidation, pending audit. Translated, if you yank the admin without a valid succession key, without going through the documented contractual handshake protocol, the system assumes the entity has been compromised, and it triggers its own defense. In other words, they fired the architect, voided the handshake, and now couldn't reach the off switch. What made it worse, what made someone in that room probably break out into a cold sweat, was that the clause wasn't ambiguous. It didn't hint. It didn't imply. It stated directly that the admin in question was tied to Redline Custodial Systems LLC, and that sovereign privileges remained intact unless revoked through both mutual agreement and physical multi-factor offboarding. My name was listed as the primary and sole controller. My LLC, my identity, my terms, all active, all valid until 2027. And they just cut me off with a badge swipe. Now they were locked out, not just digitally, but legally. They couldn't even begin a recovery until they satisfied the very clause they had triggered by accident. To stop Protocol Theta's cascade, they needed one thing: me. Not an email from me, not a Zoom call, not a letter of authorization or a signature on a PDF. They needed a live, in-person handshake, authenticated by dual biometric scan and confirmed via a physical token, one that never left my possession and was programmed to self-destruct after 3 failed attempts. And guess what that handshake required? An active security credential at Nexora, a badge, which they'd already deactivated. No badge meant no entry meant no handshake. No handshake meant no override. Jonah probably stood there, slack-jawed, while legal read the clause aloud like it was a eulogy. I imagine him looking from face to face, searching for someone to blame. But they couldn't even fire a scapegoat. This wasn't an IT error. This wasn't a bad deploy. This was contractual infrastructure, signed, sealed, audited, immutable. The platform wasn't under attack. It was in protection mode, locked down because the one identity it was built to trust had just been treated like a temp. Corporate paralysis doesn't come with screaming. It comes with silence. A silence so thick, even the ping of a Slack notification feels like a scream in a cathedral. That's the kind of silence I imagine fell over Nexora's war room once the reality settled in. They didn't just need help. They needed me, and they'd locked me out. By noon, the silence broke. But not inside Nexora. It came from outside. A federal defense contractor, Negadora's largest client by a wide margin, sent an official notice, breach of service level agreement. All telemetry data offline. No endpoint responsiveness. And most damning of all, no prior alert from Nexora's operations center. That client wasn't just buying software. They were buying uptime. They were buying integrity. They were buying the promise that when everyone else went dark, they wouldn't. And now they were blind. There was no spin they could slap on this. No server room flood, no rogue cyber attack, no weather event or supply chain excuse, just a flat line. Every public-facing service Nexora had built its reputation on had gone dark without warning. Email servers still worked, barely, but responses from the systems team were getting shorter, more brittle. Engineers pinged vendors for help. Vendors redirected them to internal logs. Internal logs? Gone. At 1:17 p.m., Nexora's board convened an emergency call. Legal and IT presented a joint summary document, typed in all caps like someone thought urgency could fix damage. Total cloud data loss. Failover system failed. Recovery not possible with current access structure. There it was. Black and white. No jargon to hide behind, no incident under review or working closely with partners. Just the raw, unfiltered sentence that makes shareholders reach for whiskey and press secretaries whisper to lawyers. And me? I was exactly where I wanted to be, nowhere near it. At 1:42 p.m., Redline Custodial Systems LLC filed a passive disclosure with the Federal Data Regulatory Board. The form was already prepared. It simply stated, custodial protocol executed per contract compliance incident. Sovereign infrastructure engaged self-regulation following administrative invalidation. Data disposal sequence triggered in accordance with Clause 18C. No breach, no external compromise, action recorded. That was it. No press release, no social media post, no interview with Wired or TechCrunch. Just a digital paper trail confirming that everything unfolded exactly as it was supposed to, because the system didn't detect malice. It detected absence. From the outside, Nexora's collapse looked like a natural disaster. Fast, quiet, unstoppable. Clients saw broken dashboards, timed out APIs, and status pages that hadn't been updated since 8:30 a.m. That was the beauty of it. There was no villain, no smoking gun, no scandal, just a boardroom full of people trying to undo something they never understood in the first place. While they argued over how to spin it, I took a walk. A real one. Out past the old rail yard near my apartment, where the wind cuts harder and the air smells like rust and dry leaves. I didn't check the news. I didn't open my inbox. I didn't need to. I'd already won. The structure I built wasn't just code and containers. It was law. Chain of custody, identity, and consequence. They thought firing me was housekeeping. What they'd actually done was pull the plug on their own immune system, and it didn't scream. It just shut them out. Quietly. Permanently. By design. By Tuesday morning, Jonah tried calling me. I saw his name flash on my phone while I stirred honey into my tea. Didn't answer. Let it ring. I watched it go to voicemail, then again 20 minutes later. Then came the text. Short, panicked, full of artificial calm. Would love to have a conversation. There's a path forward. I didn't reply. They didn't want a path forward. They wanted a shortcut out of the mess they'd built with their own hands. And I wasn't a cleanup crew. By that afternoon, PR had circulated a bland little statement. Temporary service disruptions due to infrastructure adjustments in progress. Someone on Twitter posted the source code of that sentence, joking it had more bugs than the app itself. It got 7,000 likes before Nexora's social team pulled the post. But it didn't matter. The cracks were already showing. Clients were leaving. Investors started demanding explanations, and then the internal threads began to leak. Screenshots. Snippets. A particularly damning one showed Jonah in Slack saying, "We've got the old guard out. Now we build fast." Time-stamped December 30th. Shared by an anonymous employee with a caption, and then the lights went out. By Wednesday, the whispers started. She's at Cronex now, right? No way she'd go to Cronex, would she? Cronex just passed their federal pen test with 0 flags. I said nothing. Confirmed nothing. But Cronex's compliance audit had just come back pristine, first time in 6 years. Their new infrastructure, according to a quiet industry memo, was geo-distributed, sovereign-compliant, and fail-safe enabled with biometric-bound key tiers. Sound familiar? I'd given Nexora the blueprint. They set it on fire. Cronex simply offered me the table and didn't try to rename the damn legs. They didn't hire me out of spite. They hired me out of intelligence. And I didn't sign on to destroy Nexora. I signed on to build something that wouldn't implode the second a man in a blazer called it legacy bloat. I didn't reach out to journalists. I didn't leak a story. I didn't even update my LinkedIn. But word spread anyway. The kind of quiet shift that doesn't need announcement. Gravity doesn't yell. It just pulls. And at Cronex, gravity was pulling hard. Their clients slept well that week. Their servers hummed without incident. Their board didn't ask where the resilience came from. But the techs who sat in on the deployment sessions, they knew. They'd seen it before, years ago, at a place called Nexora. Meanwhile, back in Jonah's war room, they were probably on their 5th draft of a roadmap no one believed in, trying to spin outages as opportunities, losses as learnings. Their roadmap had no roads, just desperation. I wasn't seeking revenge. I wasn't out for headlines. I was simply following the work to where it was respected. And now, the echoes of Nexora's collapse weren't coming from their servers. They were coming from the silence I left behind. Friday's emergency shareholder call wasn't live streamed, but I didn't need video to know exactly how it went down. These things have a rhythm, a pressure, a choreography of tone and silence and self-preservation. By then, the internal documents had leaked far enough that no one could pretend the collapse was temporary. Investors were demanding clarity, not optimism. The agenda was simple: explain what the hell happened, what it cost, and who was to blame. Legal opened with the usual sterile phrasing: unexpected administrative invalidation, self-regulating security protocol, license-bound infrastructural custody. But the weight of it was in one line buried halfway through their briefing: irreversible systems wipe, no available recovery option, projected loss, $42.6 million. There was no spinning that. Jonah tried anyway. Of course he did. He leaned into the camera with that corporate grit he always mistook for leadership and said, "We inherited a system too dependent on legacy processes. We're paying the price now, but this will be a turning point." He really called it a turning point. Then the chairman spoke. Quietly. Flatly. Not angry, just surgical. He held up a single page. A 5-year-old internal audit, one that had been buried beneath 4 layers of ignored recommendations. It read, simply, retain sovereign custody protocols and biometric-bound admin access. Do not attempt deactivation without verified succession infrastructure. The chairman didn't yell. He didn't throw blame. He just looked at Jonah and said, "You locked out the architect." And then he placed the paper down, face up, for everyone on the call to see, and triggered a kill switch you didn't even know existed. That was it. No threats, no theatrics, just truth. Jonah didn't get fired on that call. No performative termination, no ceremonial walkout. He simply didn't return afterward. His office badge went inactive Saturday morning. His company profile was quietly removed from the leadership page. His parking spot went empty. He didn't post a goodbye, because you don't get to write a goodbye after the house burns down and you're the one who lit the match with your own ignorance. I never heard from him again. No apology, no explanation, no accountability, but I didn't need it, because for the first time in weeks, Nexora went quiet. And this time, it wasn't because the servers were gone, it was because the room finally understood what they'd lost. Not just the data, but the person who knew how it was built. And more importantly, why it was built that way. They wanted a clean slate. They got a blank one. 2 weeks later, on a Monday so normal it felt like the world had moved on, Chronex updated their website. No banner, no breaking news splash. Just one quiet line in gray text beneath the logo. Infrastructure secured by Redline custodial systems. That was it. No announcement, no victory lap, just a footnote to anyone who looked close enough. But the right people did. Clients noticed first, not because of the line, but because things just worked. Faster, smoother, safer. Their audit reports came back flawless. Their uptime ticked to 5 nines. CIOs started calling one another asking, how did Chronex solve their failover latency issues? Nexora noticed too, but in the numbers. Within the week, 5 mid-tier clients terminated contracts early. 3 more announced cloud migration reevaluation. Investors withdrew. Revenue projections were slashed. And by the time their Q1 report leaked, Nexora's valuation had dropped 31%. Quietly. No scandal, no lawsuits, just erosion. You don't need thunder to tear something down, just gravity and time. Jonah's name disappeared from LinkedIn that same week. One day it said COO Nexora. The next, it didn't. No new job, no advisory role, just a blank space where arrogance used to live. I didn't gloat, didn't tweet, never once called a journalist. I didn't need to, because buried in every single legal folder still clinging to relevance inside Nexora, every audit log, every post-mortem draft, every compliance binder someone tried to repurpose, Clause 18C still sat there, untouched, quiet, waiting. They can revise roadmaps, they can spin narratives, but that clause, that fingerprint, that sovereign license signed in ink and ratified across 3 administrations, it's still mine. Redline Custodial Systems was never built for revenge. It was built for responsibility. And when they mistook that structure for control, when they assumed they could remove the custodian without consequence, they didn't just lose a system. They lost permanence. Clouds don't roar when they shift. They don't fight the sky, they just move. Quietly. And I moved with them.